Good evening. There was something I was about to do. What was it? My highlighter. I'll be right back. I gotta get my highlighter. So if you're watching this video on replay, I have linked the previous reading, which would be part 3. And there's also a playlist if you want to look at the playlist, so you can go back and catch up to everything that we've been reading. And if somebody is in here, people are coming in and out. I need to know what I sound like, so I might have to turn this air off. Hello, please hit the like button as you come in so people who need to find this information can find it. Let's see. Get my Florida water. I'm gonna try and stay on here for at least an hour. Pull an oracle card before we end, if y'all remind me. I was saying on Twitter earlier, not Twitter, I'm not on Twitter anymore. I've been off Twitter for years. I meant to say Threads. I was saying on Threads a lot about where we left off when we were talking about the Sybils in Rome, and how Caesar is actually a word. Well, it's a title. The word Caesar is a title. So when Augustus Caesar was calling himself Caesar and making everybody else refer to him as such, he was basically trying to get everybody to call him Lord or God. Because remember, they've already started taking over the temples. So he tries to get a consultation done by a Sybil. Her name was Tibertina, I believe. And she kept refusing him because she found it very disrespectful that he wanted to be addressed as Caesar. And so she was forced to divine for the emperor. And when she did, as she was getting ready for divination, the spirit came down and Mami appeared to Augustus Octavia, the Caesar or the emperor of Rome. And she basically, Mami scared the shit out of him. And he decided from there on out that he didn't need to be referred to as Caesar. I really lost my bookmark. I'm mad about that. Amazed and in dumbstruck awe, the emperor quickly prostrated himself onto the ground before them, offering thanks and praises to God. From that moment onward, Augustus never demanded to be addressed as God or Lord by the African clergy again. So he learned his lesson, basically not to play with Mami. Alright. I'm gonna go ahead and get started. We're on page 46. Foreign Affairs and Miraculous Cures. I can't see the chat, so let me pull the chat up on my phone. And if you guys have any questions about things that come up, I'll try my best to add more context to certain things, especially if you haven't seen the previous videos. You just have to drop whatever it is that you want to know down in the chat, because I want discussion. The purpose of this is to have discussion. I guess I should go on Threads and tell people I'm live. In the image that I put, if you look up a picture of the Sybil that they're referring to, Tibertina in these images, I think she's supposed to be these women here. But you can see how the Renaissance era was an amazing opportunity to produce new propaganda for this shift that was happening in government and politics, because they basically were able to rewrite or reimagine what actually happened. They could reimagine the faces, because these people do not look like they belong in that area at that time. There's the depiction of the Great Mother is actually a man in this image. Oh no, it's a female. It's a female Sybil, but she looks white as snow. It's just inaccurate and revised. go down here. So if anybody's watching and they want to add a timestamp, it's 11 minutes. And we're going to get into the literature now. Foreign affairs and miraculous cures. Augustus was not the only notable figure who sought the expert advice and divine wisdom of the Sybil's. He was merely following the age-old custom of African kings, military leaders, entrepreneurs, village chiefs, and heads of state who understood that if they wanted to be successful in their endeavors, it was prudent to seek the counsel of a local Sybil priestess. In one account, Alexander the Great was initially refused a divination by the Sybil priestess until she was literally dragged toward the tripos by one of the overseers, priests of Ammon, who forced her to perform a divination for him. That is when she is said to have uttered her famous words to the great Alexander, "My son, thou art invincible." Similarly, Croesus, the Phrygian Black king of Lydia, before he finalized his declaration of war against the Persians, visited all the Sybil's shrines in Greece, including sending ambassadors all the way to the shrine of Ammon in Libya to seek the consult of the wise Sybil's. So unimpeachable and esteemed was the wisdom of these African mother priestesses that heads of states were instituting new laws, that the heads of state when instituting new laws would even imply that their laws were sanctioned by the Sybil's because they knew the people would promptly comply. This is what I'm talking about when I say our mothers and their principles, their laws, because they were in accordance with divine law. They were easily adopted and followed. Seeking advice in matters of foreign affairs was not all these Black prophetesses could claim as legendary. Their oracles were credited with divine miracles, just as the Black Bacchates, male prophets of the ancestral Dionysus. The Sybil prophecies were the first to be universally written into scriptural verses and employed as protective amulets because they were believed to ward off evil. These potent verses were often consulted as divine omens, and the necessary sacrifices were offered to prevent death, sickness, poverty, and natural disasters. For example, such was the case when many took heed to the Sybil warnings of a massive earthquake, which resulted in the death of thousands, leaving an outbreak of pestilence in its wake, or the account of the raining down of thunderstones, where propitiation to the Pythonian thunder god was prescribed by the Sybil's. It was also the Sibylline oracles that prescribed the necessary sacrifices to the priestess to appease all of the divinities in the temples. It was also these African matriarchies under the auspices of the Sybils who were the civilizing authority in which all new waves of foreign immigrants, no matter how barbarous, would be gradually subdued and systematically integrated into the main society. However, no matter how civilized or culturally assimilated, none of these groups were ever allowed knowledge of the mysteries, which remained the exclusive domain of the African priestesshood. Even long after their colonization by the barbarous Dorians, who were the Greeks, though they claimed to be the sons of the non Egyptian Hercules, these primitive groups had not yet been tamed and assimilated as the earlier wave of Libyans, Aeolians, and Ionian immigrants. Thus, it was forbidden for them to even enter. Sorry, some on me. It was forbidden for them to even enter into the sacred chambers of the Sybils, whom these earlier Greeks often worshipped as gods or goddesses. In one account, Herodotus tells us of an exchange between the Sybil high priestess, Hierophile, and a Dorian invader during their violent siege of Athens. So the Dorians, I guess, occupied, that's where modern day Greece is. When he, a Greek, first went up into the citadel, meaning to seize it, just as he was entering the sanctuary of the goddess, in order to question her, the priestess arose from her throne. Before he had passed the doors and said, "Stranger from Lacedaemon, depart hence and presume not to enter the holy place. It is not lawful for a Dorian to set a foot here." On another occasion, Aeneas, the Pelasgian, Trojan war hero and initiate into the tradition of the Black Venus, reported his experience after visiting for a divination at the famous Sybil cave of Apollo at Cumæa, Rome. There is on the Anubian coast a vast cave cut out of the rock, into which opens 100 mouths, whence do proceed as many voices, which are the answers of the Sybil. He came to the entrance when the prophetess said, "'Tis time to pray for revelations. The divinity is present." As she spake the words at the very entrance, her countenance and color changed, and her hair was disordered. Her breast heaved, and her violent passions swelled her. She seemed bigger than ordinary, and her voice appeared to be different from that of all mortals upon this, her immediate seizure by the divinity. Okay, so they're describing possession. Because that is what the Sybils do. They speak directly to the dead and the gods. The author assures us that the Aeneas reported actually transpired. What Aeneas reported actually transpired. He further tells us that the entire coast of which is now called Italy was devoted to that African god and called Saturnia by the inhabitants, that Aeneas and the Trojans came to Italy. All the festivals, all Roman authors assure us, and so do the Solomonites, used in their sacrifices and festivals, as also the Sibylline and Pythic oracles, and many other indications there are of the same. Saturnalia was a major African and Tamil festive day to celebrate the safe journey of the ancestors from the flood. Saturn is always time and anything that has to do with time, the dead, ancestors, tradition, casting out demons and calling up the dead. The Sybil's were known to effect miraculous cures, credited in today's Judeo-Christian tradition exclusively to Christ. However, it was originally the Sybil's prior to Christ who were hailed for giving sight to the blind, curing lameness, epileptics, deaf mutes, and lepers. They were said to cast out demons and even to raise up the dead. This last reference is probably meant to call up and materialize the spirit of a dead person. For example, the Cumaean Sybil, Hierophile, was famed for calling up the spirit of the apostle Samuel from the dead. This ancient ritual is still in practice today, performed by a sacred priesthood known as Amagazis in the Mami Wata Vodun traditions of West Africa. The Sybil's were also believed to be immortal and never to die. In one account, it was believed that their spirits, after death, went into the air and became the power of divination by omens and soothsayings, that her body was turned into earth and grew up into herbs. Life after death is a cosmogonic belief that has its counterpart in the Mami Wata Vodun as the loco tree and the Vodou Azizas. Aziza. I feel like Aziza is connected to Urzuli, if I'm not mistaken. Know about the loco tree. The over-embellished biblical lore recounting Christ sending a pantheon of demons into a herd of pigs was not an aberration from African sacrosanct divine priestly powers. Exorcising malevolent spirits is a very common and customary purification African ritual. Prescribed for most exorcisms or when the manifestational behavior of a deity demands the erection of an altar. One historic example of this occurred during the time of the Sybil's, when Athens had suffered a catastrophic plague. The Sybil's commanded that a purification rite be performed to appease the spirits. They did this by ceremoniously sending one black sheep and one white sheep through the city, and wherever the sheep clasped an altar was to be erected. Oracles, prophecies, and holy maxims. As African civilizations established and maintained their military, political, and cultural predominance in the ancient world, the Sybil's availed themselves to all the world's inhabitants. However, they and their divinities were most comfortable within their own cultural milieu, and the majority of their prophecies and daily ritual activities were originally localized and confined to the African city-states, towns and villages where their temples, clan totems, immediate and extended families resided. As long as these provinces were not violated or threatened with invasions, the deities, as a rule, remained apolitical and focused on the well-being and the preservation of their own. However, the oracles and prophecies of the Sybil's were employed and trusted universally as the holy word of the gods, and depended upon in all manner of life and sudden travails. For example, it was reported by Livy during the reign of Mark Antony that when in the days of Mark Antony, soldiers were destroyed by storms, and owls and wolves invaded cities. When unexpected sun eclipses darkened the republic, when a thunderbolt damaged the scepter of Jupiter, and when animals brought forth creatures outside their species, the Sibylline oracles were made known, with the result that some men became inspired and uttered prophecies. The popular phrase, the lot or die has been cast, is derived directly from the many forms of divination employed by the Sybil's, Pythias, in which either a dice or shells were thrown and read according to a list of characters written on a chart. The now widely used Christian custom of praying over unopened letters was already in practice for hundreds of years by some Sybil's, who actually divined and responded to their unopened letters accurately, conveying the seeker's prayers and inquiries. Division in the Holy Empire, the patriarchal revolts. Before there were race and class wars, the first human factional wars were gender. The first groups to engage in such warfare were the Africans. The first level of power in which control was sought was spiritual, economic, and political. Africans, possessing the highest levels of spiritual, magical, and mystical power and knowledge for centuries through their ambitious tutelary and clan gods, often competed and waged bitter spiritual warfare of mythologic proportion against one another. Now we're talking about the conjure wars. Okay, division in the Holy Empire, the patriarchal revolts. This is talking about the conjure. Africans possessing the highest levels of spiritual, magical, and mystical power for centuries often competed and waged bitter spiritual warfare of mythologic proportion against one another. War is always cosmic. Every move, every strategy in war is intentional. And some decisions are made based off of, for example, I'm watching House of Dragons right now, and I can't remember what episode I'm on, but the king, y'all forgive me because I'm really bad with names. The king who died, his dying, it wasn't his dying wish. I don't know. I kind of fell asleep on it. But listen, what I was getting at is that he basically made a decision off of what he dreamed, what he saw. And he passed that dream down because he wanted the next heir to the throne to know what he saw, the vision that he had, so that they could protect their kingdom and protect their people. It's the same with this. People didn't take their dreams as nonsense or just your brain trying to get rid of excess information, which is what some scientists were saying. You're being shown things to prepare you, or sometimes it's something that you're just supposed to experience if you're traveling. But they always took dreams seriously. And if you had a dream and you couldn't figure out what it meant, and it was bothering you to know what it meant, you would seek out a diviner or do your own divination to reveal to you what that dream actually means. And a lot of the times, these men and these women were dreaming about stuff that was about to happen. A lot of catastrophic events. I dream about weather stuff all the time. A lot of catastrophic events or premonitions that something is going to happen. Those things were investigated in these times. They weren't taken lightly. And the kings and the military officials all used this information to make important decisions. So if a king had to figure out how many people he wanted on the battlefield, he might choose a number that was recommended to them by a Sybil, or something that they felt like they needed to do, something that was symbolic to them based off of their own visions, their own dreams, their own interpretation of what they needed to do. Everything is conjure. These divine wars began as one between competing clan gods and soon escalated beyond what the gods had originally intended. The first apostasy or fall against the divine African mother appears to have taken place in ancient Egypt. Historians of ancient Egypt, when describing Egypt's rise as a global military power, often assume an amicable joining of Upper and Lower Egypt under King Menes, hailing this event as the greatest political achievement in Egyptian history. This monumental event claim began the golden age of military conquest and global expansion, and the unchallenged rule of Egypt's patriarchal pharaohs. And according to most, it established Egypt's inviolable position as a legitimate world power. However, that is the view from history provided by the patriarchs. Upon closer examination and considering the historical evidence from the view of the matriarchs, indicates that this amicable joining might not have been such a crowning achievement in Egypt's history at all, but rather the opposite. We've always been told the patriarchal view, so now we're going to get the view of the matriarchs. In spite of Egypt's patriarchal military might, the kings and pharaohs of Egypt still had to capitulate to the conquered and declining matriarchs, for whom they still must claim their divine blood and spiritual inheritance. They still cannot take the throne without their connection to their mother, without the mother's blood. This inescapable fact, as well as her exclusive sacerdotal authority and political influence in the world, generated much jealousy, envy, and resentment towards them. So much that it is alleged that 1,000 years later, as matriarchal rule gave way to new waves of patriarchal revolts, the powerful priesthoods of Amun in Cunum and the clans of Horus boldly declared something never before imagined. They began invading and usurping the holy temples of these divine African mothers, starting in Thebes. They then invaded and usurped the major Sybil temples in Libya and Ethiopia. As a consequence, many of these matriarchal clans fled north in East Africa, taking refuge on remote Grecian island countries such as Ionia. Many in Thebes fled to the now Grecian Argos or settled into the ancient African Mitanni kingdom territories in Asia Minor, which is Turkey. Many also fled to My, now Grecian Mycenae and rebuilt their temples, all continuing their service to Mami Isis, known to them as Demeter, and established sacred African societies such as the Desmophorians and the Scirophorians. Finally, hundreds, if not thousands, of Sybils and other priestesses opted instead to commit suicide by jumping into the Nile River rather than submit to patriarchal authority. I probably shouldn't have said that word on here, but fuck it, we here now. All right, those temple priests of Ammon who revolted against them slaughtered the ancestral python of the Sybils, a deliberate act of divine warfare that centuries later, Wegbaja, the first king of Dahomey, is alleged to have committed in his takeover of sacerdotal power against the matriarchal clans in West Africa. After Ammon's priests slaughtered the sacred python, they demanded that separate grand temples be built to Apollo and Zeus atop of them. Okay. This is some wild shit. The temple priests of Ammon, who had already revolted against the Sybils and slaughtered Sybils, is alleged to have committed in his takeover of sacerdotal power against the matriarchal clans in West Africa. That's how the kingdom of Dahomey came to be. Okay, after Ammon's priests slaughtered the sacred python, they demanded that separate grand temples be built to Apollo, which was Ammon, and Zeus, which was Horus, atop of them. These priests then proceeded to rearrange the cosmological pantheon, placing themselves at the head. A new patriarchal mythos was invented, and the sacerdotal doves were replaced with the fiery eagles of Horus. So the whole purpose was to take a system that was already established and to turn it upside down. Really, it's so greedy. It's so greedy because they already had, you were already kings. You already belonged to, they just wanted the power of the sacred mothers, which with great power comes great responsibility. They didn't even know what they were bringing upon themselves, the type of karma that they were bringing upon themselves and their lineage. They changed the pantheon so that the men were now equal, if not superior, to the other goddesses and the other spirits from these matriarchal clans. The Sybils were then ordered to serve under Apollo and the thunder god Zeus, Horus, headed by male overseers. The priests then seized control over the Vestals, the virgin priestesses, controlling all of their divine functions, especially that of prophecy and healing. According to Greek historian Pausanias, the Sybils would often express their contempt against patriarchal aggression in sacred song and poetic verse. In one famous song recounting the historical truth about their genesis, Sybil reminds these priestesses of divine reminds these priests of her divine role in their very existence. For what the world was deluged with a flood of waters, and one man of good repute alone was left and in a wooden house, sailed o'er the waters with the beasts and birds. I ordered that the world might be refilled. I was his son's bride and was of his race, to whom the first things happen and the last. We are all made known, and thus from mine own mouth let all of these truthful things remain declared. His son's bride is an allegorical reference, reminding the patriarchal masses that the divine kingships of which they proudly claim their legitimacy is still wrought through the blood of the African mother. However, these voracious proclamations fell on deaf ears, and over time the matriarchies lost enormous political, economic, and territorial ground. Egypt's patriarchal wars began under Menes, vying for total control of their ancient mothers' empires across Asia Minor, Libya, Troy, and Italy, continued unabated. However, their competitors for these empires were not only other African patriarchs. Egypt had no shortage of enemies, of whom they often waged a constant battle for control, namely the fiercely patriarchal Levitical Black Hebrews, later followed by the Dorian Greeks, and then the Assyrians, the Persians, the White Turks, and finally, centuries later, the Romans. In the holy temples seized by the priests of Ammon, the Ashe of the African matriarchs had long ago departed. Each temple was soon plagued by spiritual and political corruption, commercialization, internal power struggles, and sexual abuse, like the rest of these damn temples. Shade, no shade. That's just has become commonplace. These crimes further added to devalue and undermine the Sybil's exclusive authority as the original and divine mouthpiece of the god or goddesses. Over time, the oracular work, divinations that traditionally only required one Sybil to perform, now demanded the combined power of three. Oh, because the priests were doing it. Centuries later, after the invention of Christianity, Bishop Eusebius, the so-called father of church history, delighting in the decline of their most fiercest competitor, took advantage of this in facing the Roman papal's agenda against African spiritual predominance in the world. He propagandized and attributed the gradual collapse of the African matriarchies to Christ, who exorcised all demons, including the Sybil oracles. Although these unfortunate events began the decline of African matriarchal political power, it did not remove them entirely from their seat of sacerdotal power, in spite of the patriarchal takeover of their temples. The deity to whom these Sybil's were the mouthpiece is still Mami, who was worshipped under the many appellations of Isis, a title meaning logos or wisdom, and the fire thunder spirit of the ancestral father Python, originally manifested by Horus, who became known under many names, including Asclepius, Dionysus, Attis, Zeus, and Apollo. Although the Sybil's recognized Apollo and Zeus politically, they never accepted his predominance over Mami. Nonetheless, It was perhaps the threatening invasions from the barbarous northern Aryan tribes which forced an uneasy political alliance between the Sybil's and the Egyptian pharaohs. More significantly, the usurpation of their temples by a fanatical patriarchal sect of the priests of Ammon earned them wrath and contempt of Mami, aka she started fucking them up. Are y'all saying anything in the chat? Because I have not checked it. Hi to those that are joining. Hey. Okay, so we're told that under the patriarchs, the nations have become completely corrupted. During prophetic pronouncements, the divine oracles of Mami, speaking through the Sybil's, would always express her disapproval of their actions in her greetings to them, just like a mother would. Routinely, she would commence her oracles with the following greeting: mortal men, bodies of clay, vile nothings, how can ye dare to elevate yourselves? And why do ye not think of not think of the end of the world? Angered by the usurpation of her temples and the general corruption wrought throughout the land, the divine African mother prophesied through her Sybil's great woes on the matriarchal cities of Lycia, Smyrna, Ephesus, Corinth, and others, where her temples have been seized and corrupted. Unlike what has been accepted as biblical prophecies today, where the future of Africa and its peoples are mysteriously absent, the Sybil prophecies, from which biblical doctrines are actually derived, were very specific to their own African people. In the beginning, as their matriarchal kingdoms, divine power and political influence around the world began to grow, their prophecies became even more central to global events and took on a more international, multi-ethnic tone, particularly as they faced the inevitable threat from the invading North Aryan tribes. These tribes eventually were either absorbed by the matriarchs or they became the new conquerors. As these foreign tribes became the new rulers, the prophecies of the Sybil's became even more pronounced. Mama was mad. It is alleged that it was her anger at the seizure of her temples and the subsequent corruption that usually followed, why she allowed for Egypt and many of her African nations to fall victim to barbaric and foreign invasions and ultimate ruin as divine punishment. For example, in one not so corrupted prophetic verse, she proclaims through the Sybil, "Alas for thee, O Libya! Alas for thee, O sea and land in the western nations! How shall you come to the miserable day? You shall come exercised in a conflict which will be terrible and difficult. You shall have a fearful judgment again, and you all shall come to destruction because you have destroyed the great Ammon temple of the immortal God, grievously grinding it as if it were the iron teeth. For this cause thou shalt see thy land filled with dead bodies, some slain in war, and all of the force of evil spirits, by famine and plague, and by enemies of a barbarous fury. All thy land shall become a desert, and thy cities be forsaken." She said, "Stop playing in my face." That's basically what that was. Under Patriarch, this, as most of the Sybil prophecies, were altered to name the temple Ammon and substitute to goddess to read as God. However, the Amphe temples in Libya were originally dedicated to Athena, Minerva, and Poseidon. Nonetheless, anywhere the sacred temples were violated, usurped, neglected, or destroyed, these prophetic proclamations of doom were made. sacred temples were violated, usurped. They kept getting the same prophecy. In another pronouncement, she further warns that in the west, a star shall shine, which is called comet, and is a sign of war, famine, and death by plague, and of the slaughter of great commanders and noblemen. And there shall be other great signs among men. For the Maeotic lake and deep tunnels shall not continue their flux of waters, and there shall be plowed land in its channel. But the current shall become innumerable. There shall be great openings of the earth, and vast caverns shall appear, and men with their cities shall be swallowed up. These cities shall be overthrown in Asia Minor, Curb, Pendonic, Colophos, Ephesus, Nicaea, Antiochia, Tanagra, Sinope, Smyrna, Morris, and these towns in Europe, Sygra, Clitus, Basilis, Merope, Antigone, Magnesia, Mycenae, Paphia, wealthy Gaza, Hierapolis, and Astapale. Ooh, I'm murdering these words. Then know thou the pernicious people of Egypt are near destruction. And then the last year will be over with the Alexandrians. Whew. She foretold of famine, disease, and pestilence, and it was usually during these end cycles that she would speak of the coming of a Savior from the east. Varro tells us the Savior was Isus or Krishna, claiming that he, the Savior, would dominate the whole and would become a triumphant national hero. Continuing with the fate of Egypt, she proclaims, O Egypt, a terrible great slaughter shall befall thee, which thou didst hope will never befall thee. A sword shall pass through the midst of thy lands, and dispersion and death and famine shall follow. But in the 7th generation of the kings thou shalt have rest. She continues, Woe to thee, O land of Gog and Magog, lying between the Ethiopian rivers! How great an effusion of blood shalt thou receive, and men shall call thee the house of judgment, and thy well-watered land shall drink black blood. Mentioned in the book of Ezekiel, Gog is a derisive corruption of the ancient African Gargars, located in what is now the Armenian highlands. Gargars is a landlocked country bordering Turkey and Iran. The Gargars are also known as the Garganesians, and is also one of the ancient locations of the African Arab, the Ethiopians, who founded the matriarchal Mitanni Empire, and is known as the ancestral home of Queen Nefertiti. Gargars was believed to be the actual location of Mount Arata. Just as their Elamite neighbors, the Gargars' ancestral home was probably Sheba, actually Saba, meaning serpent people. Sheba is the name of the ancient city that lies between the Ethiopian rivers, an ancient home of the Sybil, Makeda, properly known as Queen of Sheba. Queen of Sheba was a Sybil. Every queen was a Sybil, but not all Sybil's were queens. Opportunistic rise of the imperial Roman papacy. Over the centuries, the Sibylline prophecies began to take on a more global and nationalistic tone. As Africa began to lose her colonies and political and economic influence in Asia Minor and in the Mediterranean regions, the geopolitical paradigm gradually shifted. During the Roman era, particularly as the Roman Church changed from an apostolic secular body to an expansionist imperial power, there is a conscious reassessment of Roman racial and cultural identity, particularly its gradual shift from the worship and dependency on African goddesses and sacerdotal authority to that of the newly emerging Roman papacy. African matriarchal culture African matriarchal cultural and spiritual predominance in existence since the beginning of time began to be viewed by Roman authorities as a serious cultural liability and an obstacle to the carefully veiled Eurocentric. Okay, Mama's already some of these words. I don't even know how to say this. We're gonna look it up. Because when you don't know something, you can just look it up. How do you say this? Ecumenical? Ecumenical. Ecumenical, representing a number of different Christian churches. Okay. All right, an obstacle to the carefully veiled Eurocentric ecumenical ideals now being espoused by Greek philosophers in the church papals. The Roman Church, lacking an original ecclesiastical, liturgical, and theological doctrine of its own, still depended heavily on the Sibylline prophecies and the African, Judaic, and Mithraic religious customs in legitimizing its superior position over the competing Hebrew doctrines. So this is where they had a problem because they still wanted, the Roman Church still needed to, they wanted to flip everything, but they had to figure out a way for people to still want to follow because everybody knew who the rulers were supposed to be. Everybody knew because this is how it had always been. Everybody knew that you were supposed to, respect at minimum and follow or listen to the prophecies coming from these oracles, coming from these Sybil's, because they had proved themselves. They were very accurate. And everybody knew that the black woman was the physical representation of God. Everybody knew this. The new Euro-patriarchal world order could no longer afford to tolerate the notion of relying on African matriarchal divine predominance as its fundamental theological and cultural base. Unlike seizing the spoils of war, the African divinities whose mysteries the Romans did not understand were ancestrally linked, and thus its divine power could never be completely usurped and controlled by them. Because they didn't share the blood, they could not. It's like today, anybody can decide that they want to be a pastor or, any other clergy member for the most part. But in these traditions, it had to be inherited. You may have a call, but it has to be, you have to be chosen, like it's inherited by blood. And so they were having a hard time because they couldn't fully control or get these divinities to respond to their requests. Furthermore, the patriarchal Hebrew shepherds, whose holy laws and canons do not predate the prophecies of the Sybil's, also revolted against them, and they later came to be known historically as the Semitic Jews of Palestine. They had long ago broken away from the matriarchal orders, and following the historic trend began by the patriarchal priests of Horus and the Babylonian Marduk, the Jews did away with the worship of their primary black goddess, Yahweh, Anath Yahu. Can't say that word. Anath Yahu. That was the name used to refer to Yahweh. That was her feminine name, just like Allah is just the male, the masculine name that was originally meant to refer to a lot. It's controversial. Some people think that Allah is a deity. Some people say Allah and Alat are consorts or two sides of the same coin. So it really depends. But when you look into the history of Islam and the Muslims pre-Muhammad, everybody was still worshiping the goddesses, not Allah. Allah wasn't even a thing. However, the Jews, inheritors of theological foundation, originally established by the African matriarchs, were entirely familiar with African theology, philosophy, and sacred rites. However, in their revolt against them, they needed their own male god and Messiah to prove the legitimacy of their newly chosen status, as well as to free them from Roman oppression and tyranny. Both groups, Jews and Roman papacy, wasted no time in seizing, plagiarizing, and ultimately destroying the original Sibylline prophecies by replacing them with corrupted or complete forgeries to meet their own political, religious agenda. Then they flooded the global community with these bogus doctrines, adding further to the confusion in their ongoing propaganda wars against the Roman papacy. More significantly, by proclaiming the prophetic messages of the Sybil's entirely to themselves as the chosen ones, helped to undermine and to conceal the African specificity and spiritual identity of the Sybil's, because that's important. They left that part out. They were trying to cover it up. In doing so, the original message and target of the Sybil prophecies has been obscured and lost over the centuries, thus omitting an extremely critical historical element of African ecclesiastical and prophetic history. I feel like a lot of their work is gone, but I feel like they had so much work, because y'all have to remember that the Sybil's and their temples were scattered about, similar to modern day churches. Like, I live in a Bible Belt. I actually live in a city that I live next to the city that has the most churches per capita in the entire country. So there's literally there's a church right here on my street. There's a church right down the street. There's a church behind me. There's a church in front of me. There's like 5 churches next to me right now. That's how the Sybil's temples were. All these temples, they were scattered about like modern day churches. And all of a sudden, people were being forced to get rid of it's kind of like all of a sudden an entirely different clergy and pantheon comes in. And everybody's just supposed to agree and go along with it. This is why it had to be forced. And this is why a lot of people still practice their pagan ways or still worship idols and all that stuff that you hear about in the Bible. The Sibylline oracles were deliberately doctored to attack the very essence of African philosophy. That's what I was going to say. But I feel like because the Sibyls were scattered all about, and because they were organized and had mystery schools and all of this stuff, I think a lot of their books are hidden. I feel like there's a ton of books that a specific group of people has access to. Books that haven't been completely tainted and have some prophecies in them. And the church is finding ways to use propaganda and ritual and all of this other stuff to counteract these prophecies, or try and stop to delay these prophecies from coming true. But you can only do that for so long. The Sibylline oracles were deliberately doctored to attack the very essence of African philosophy, theology, ritual, and liturgical practices, of whom the Sibyls were the very epitome. More revealing, it redirected their prophetic messages away from the African kingdoms, villages, and nation heads for whom it was originally intended. What remained instead was a wholesale condemnation of African spirit and culture, with an external focus exclusively on the Masonic hopes of the very Jewish and Roman papal forces responsible for its destruction. So basically, she's saying that they demonized African culture, African ways of worship, anything that was deemed pagan, because you got to keep in mind that the Greeks and the Celts and the Greeks and the Romans took the old gods that belonged to Mami and changed the pantheon around. Meanwhile, the Brits and the Celts, a lot of them, especially the Celts, they hadn't completely denied the existence of the Great Mother and Mami and all of her spirits. But their spirits had different names because of the region that they were in. So she wasn't called Mami Isis. She wasn't called those names. She had different names like Demeter and stuff like that, the gods that were connected to the Celtic pantheon. Ooh, it's a mind fuck. Additionally, all of the major prophecies of the Sibyls demanded these propitiation sacrifices to appease the African gods, goddesses, and ancestors, which was yet another source of contention with the Christian papal, who bitterly denounced and rejected them as heathen abominations. Consequently, the papacy rushed to either destroy or to remove these crucial utterances from the Sybil prophecies as well. This is the shit that drives me insane, because the Great Mother is the Great Mother. She's a mother. So just saying that you're not going to obey and follow the instruction of your mother after she's giving you chance after chance after chance to redeem yourself, just like I said in that post I put on Patreon where I was talking about the Iami and how the Iami represent the divine mothers. They represent mothers in general. celestial mothers, ancient mothers, primordial mothers, earthly mothers, because there's 3 different Iyami, and they all have different temperaments, and they all have different gifts. Just like you may be able to piss off your mother, and she's easier to appease. She's easier to get back on your side. She has more mercy and compassion and will take your apologies and move on and not have resentment. But you may have a aunt or a grandmother who's a lot harsher. It's going to take a lot more to prove yourself to her. It's going to take a lot more for her to forgive you. It's the same thing with this. It's the same thing with this. So basically, the Sybil's were still getting prophecies that sacrifice can be made to rectify this situation. But the church was still hell-bent on saying that this was an abomination and that it wasn't valuable information. This is some shit. I'm about to get off of here in a minute, y'all, because I gotta... Yeah, I gotta go. Though the Jews and the Roman papal authorities were competing enemies, both were in agreement that the African divine matriarchal authority had to be discredited and ultimately destroyed. The motivations of the Jews stemmed from their hatred of the divine African mother and their bitter break with the patriarchal pharaonic orders of ancient Egypt. The Roman Church's usurpation of her sacerdotal power was motivated out of nothing less than mere political expediency and economic necessity. Oh boy. In the end, what remained for the African was a corruption of their own spiritual doctrines, in which the prophecies of the Sybil's were rewritten to forecast Levitical Jews waiting for their Jehovah and the Christians waiting for their second coming of Christ, while the African people and others are left begging for the crumbs of salvation that would fall from the table of what amounts to little more than a politically orchestrated doctrinal and historical lie. Mother is eating us alive with this. Oh my God. She said politically orchestrated doctrinal and historical lie. All told, there remains scant credible evidence from either of these groups of the existence of an ancient omnipotent power independent of that divine African mother. Though the Sybil's had lost much of their global kingdoms and international influence, their spiritual advice, healings, and prophecies were still being sought by military leaders, heads of state, and nobility, albeit under the cover of the night. Those Sybil's who were not as prominent simply faded away into their rural villages, sacred caves, mystery schools, grottos, and ghettos. Their prophecies now being universally discredited in the ancient world as the work of crazed women harboring demonic spirits. However, this perception would change temporarily as a new generation of Roman patricians came of age. It is important to note that these African-centered prophecies were said to have been given over a period of more than 4,000 years. That is really important to note. That is super important to note. 4,000 years of prophecy, and they were still doing the foolishness. Centuries before the alleged era of the Hebrew prophets or any concept of Christianity, Hinduism, or Islam, where Genesis began in the, oh, I skipped a line. Christianity, Hinduism, or Islam were ever conceived. The Sybil's claimed in one prophecy that their genesis began in the 10th age of the world, during which time Saturn, Titan, and Japhet were born from the union of heaven and earth. She recounts in detail about the divine lineages of Saturn and all the misfortunes that would befall them in the war of the Titans, and the ultimate division of the world amongst the children of Jupiter, Neptune, and Pluto. In the above allegory, the Sybil appears to be making reference to a mythological story of Saturn, whom, having stolen the rightful succession to the throne from his oldest brother Titan, due to the manipulations of Saturn's wife Rhea. Titan then declared war against Saturn, defeated him, and held Saturn and his brother captive until Jupiter, Titan's elder son, became a man and released them from their captivity. As reward, the world was then divided amongst Titan's sons, Jupiter, Neptune, and Pluto. Placed back into African cosmology, the Titans and the Titanesses, or divinities, lords, are the ancient African pantheon of the 7 celestial deities from the Pleiades star system, who were served by the Sybils, the 7 sisters. They were introduced into Babylonian and Palestinian astrology by the Afro-Canaanite, Phoenician, matriarchal clans who settled into ancient Corinth around 2000 BCE. 7 became the mystical number of the ancestral deity Dionysus, and later was applied to the minor fire deity Jehovah. It was also the number by which the African solar gods were torn into pieces and resurrected again, Osiris being the first. The division of the world was believed to be making reference to the fall of the Tower of Babel in ancient Babylon, resulting in the rise of a second Egypt, Persia and Media, Ethiopia, and later Assyria, Macedonia, and then Rome. It appears to also be making direct reference to the fall of the African matriarchies, resulting in the rise of the patriarchs and the subjugation of African female spiritual and political power, creating a permanent division or fragmenting of the African Sibs. However, around 573 to 808 BCE, with the raging wars and bitter feuding between the Levitical Hebrews and Romans, the heathen prophecies of the Sybils had proven so accurate and of such global and religious significance that the patriarchal world also began to take note. Today, in Western history and mythological literature, originally meant to conceal their African identity, the Sybil sacred temples are obscurely referred to as simply oracles, not noting their political importance, not noting their economic importance, not noting any of their contributions to society, just calling them oracles. However, as the main centers of African spiritual life, they were clearly much more than that, and will henceforth be referred to in their current African religious vernacular as shrines, egbays, or temples. Additionally, it is important to note that these Sybil prophetess and the miracles that they performed were never viewed from an African worldview as something extraordinary, remarkable, or even miraculous. This attitude was not born out of disrespect, but rather, when placed within their own religio-cultural African context, direct contact with the spirits was common and rather routine in their daily lives. They were not magical manifestations typically meant to awe or to entertain, just as today. It was even considered almost sacrilege either to speak directly about them or take them out of proportion. It was the Europeans, specifically the Greeks and later the Romans, who found African ritual and spiritual phenomena extraordinary, and later, through the auspices of the Roman Church, began to categorize them as miracles, making much ado about something viewed as common by the African. For the African, the so-called spiritual phenomena was never viewed as important as the actual divine message and the sacrifices that were needed to appease the anger of the ancestors and their tutelary deities. Whew. That was a lot, y'all. My voice is already starting to crack. So we're going to end here. Page 62 of the Sybil's, the first prophetesses of Mami Wata by Mama Zogbe. We're going to stop on page 62, and when I come back, thank you for everybody that's coming in and actually liking the video. When you come in, please like the video so this can show up in people's algorithm, people who are looking for this information. Because I don't have time to be posting on every single media platform, even though I will do it when I do have time. It's just not gonna happen. Okay, so the next time I come back for part 5, we're going to be talking about the priestesses of Mami. All of the different priestesses. This is going to be really interesting because then y'all are going to be able to connect the dots even more when it comes to Greek and Roman mythology. You're going to realize or recognize a lot of the goddesses in other cultures. All right. I gotta go, y'all. I'm tired. I sure am. I hope you enjoyed this reading. I hope y'all can hear me. And make sure you share this video, and I will see y'all in the next one.